everyone, and welcome once again to Reverb. My name is Alex Helberg, and I'm joined on the mic, as always, by my co-host and co-producer, Calvin Pollock. How you doing, Calvin?
Doing good, Alex. How about you?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. I am extra excited today, actually, to be joined by a guest co-host. Very excited to have her on the mic. Our friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Hae-In Idzik, Assistant Professor of Rhetoric at Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you for joining us, Sarah.
Hey, y'all. Thanks so much for having me on the pod.
Yes, of course. I feel like this was a long time coming. I've wanted to have you on as a guest, or in this case, as a guest interviewer for a while now. So when you showed up in the acknowledgement section of the book that we are reviewing today, I was like, okay, we have to have Sarah on the podcast. It's really, really good to have you here. So as I alluded to there, we are all here today to discuss a book that we're all three quite fond of, which is Making the Human, Race, Allegory, and Asian Americans, alongside its author, who we are also honored to be joined by, Corinne Mitsuye Sugino, Assistant Professor in the Department of English and Center for Ethnic Studies at The Ohio State University. Corinne, welcome to Reverb.
Thank you so much, Alex, Calvin, and Sarah, for having me on this episode. I'm really excited to be here.
Of course.
Yeah, it was really such a pleasure to read this book and to see so many things, so much of your work that I've experienced in other contexts come together in such an amazing way. We wanted to start by talking about the title. Your book's argument really begins with this really provocative title, Making the Human. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of the title? Who or what processes contribute to this making and reshaping of this construct of the human and this concomitant process of racializing and excluding others?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that question. I had gone with Making the Human as the title because the book grapples with the role that Asian American racialization and gendering play in the construction of the human. And so the concept for the book came out of my interest in how Asian Americans had become increasingly highly visible figures in a number of contemporary social controversies. For example, with the Atlanta shooting, Asian Americans are narrated as the sources of sexualized temptation. In the affirmative action case, Asian Americans are framed as studious and meritorious, but also helpless victims in need of saving. In popular media like Crazy Rich Asians, Asian Americans are framed as empowered feminist agents and symbols of diversity. And in the wider sort of pandemic rhetorics, right, Asian Americans are framed as these carriers for disease. And so I say all of this not to suggest that these narratives are equal or the same or whatever, but that Asian Americans become key narrative figures in all of these various parts of public life, right? In public health, in popular media, in the law and education, so on and so forth. And so in each of those cases, I'm interested in how Asian Americans take shape as narrative figures and how those narratives are doing work, right? To shore up American exceptionalism, to police the boundaries of the nation state, to redeem the myth of meritocracy, to frame the US carceral state as inclusive, blah, 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 so on and so forth, right? And the point is not that they are the only sort of figures that matter in these contexts, but I'm interested in seeing what Asian Americans are doing in these narratives and what they represent, what value judgments the narratives imply, and what forms of hierarchy they normalize or resist. And so that is how I kind of ended up theorizing what I call racial allegory, which is the way that cultural, media, and institutional narratives mobilize categories of difference, including the category of Asian American, to stabilize Western man. And so this is where the Making the Human part comes in, is in my discussion of Western man. This is a term that I draw from Black studies scholars like Zakiya Jackson, Sylvia Wynter, and Denise Ferreira da Silva, who highlight the human not as this purely biological or inherent or immutable category, but rather as something that is socially formulated through global colonial and anti-Black violence. And so Sylvia Wynter in particular looks at how the histories of slavery, colonization, and the European quote unquote discovery of the quote unquote new world imposes what she calls the overrepresentation of Western man as what it means to be human, highlighting the white property Euro-American subject as this sort of transcendent figure that stands in for what it means to be human against and valued over Black people in particular and colonized and marginalized people more broadly. And here she's in conversation with like Fanonian sociogeny and so on and so forth. And so all of this is to say that we're conditioned to think of the human as this purely biological concept, as a neutral concept, as a descriptive concept. But these scholars are arguing, right, that the human is, a combination of what Winter refers to of bios and mythoi, right? So it's not just a physiological or a biological category, but also a conceptual category that society creates and polices through storytelling and narrative. And so I'm drawing my ideas about racial narrative from that. And I'm interested in how these narratives about Asian Americans in all of these various different arenas of public life are shoring up a limited understanding of what it means to be human and a series of concomitant value systems, right? And so what do abstract concepts like diversity mean, or justice mean, or discrimination mean, or family, or kinship, or whatever? And so I'm interested in thinking about how they work to sort of construct this limited understanding of what it means to be human. And so I'm heavily influenced by these scholars, but at the same time, the scholarship on Western man hasn't traditionally focused on Asian Americans, and Asian American studies hasn't always dialogued with scholarship on Western man, but I was interested in where Asian American racialization sort of fit into all of this. And so I argue that Asian American racialization plays an important role in stabilizing Western man and, shoring up these abstract concepts. So each chapter is centered around a series of like abstract values that help us make sense of the human as a figure. So discrimination and justice, right? What is the human figure that's discriminated against? And so each chapter is on a different allegory. Allegories of family and mothering in the Crazy Rich Asians chapter, families of body and nation in the COVID-19 chapter. And so here I'm interested in the relationship between anti-Asian racism, anti-Black violence, and the sort of porous boundaries of the human. And that's kind of where the title pulls its name from.
I love how incredibly dense and rich this is. Like your analysis and your theoretical framing is so rich and complex. I guess just to spring off of your response, I love that you are bringing together Asian American racialization and anti-Blackness through literatures about Western man, and anti-Blackness as inextricably tied up with anti-Asian violence is a running theme throughout the book. And I'm wondering, especially from a disciplinary perspective, because you mentioned that Asian American studies hasn't always dialogued with Western man in the same way, like in communication studies and rhetoric, studies about Asian American issues typically does not always dialogue with anti-Blackness. And I'm wondering if you want to say a little bit about the importance of conceptualizing Asian American racialization with anti-Blackness for comm studies or rhetoric like you've done in your book.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think I'm drawn to the concept of racial allegory and these sort of ideas in part because it helps to give me a vocabulary for describing anti-Asian racism in a way that understands the role of narrative and the rhetorical elements and its material effects without sort of falling back into a discussion of false representation or inaccurate stereotypes. And, there's good work on that stuff too, but I'm more interested in how it relates to this sort of construction of the human. But the relationship to anti-Blackness is really important too, because for me, it's not my goal is not to be like this stuff on Western man. Yeah, cool. Now Asians also, right? I think that anti-Asian racism is related to and informed by anti-Blackness, but I don't think they're synonymous. And actually, this is the reason why I think there's a lot of conversations about whiteness in, rhetorical theory. And like that stuff is good too, but I picked Western man and not whiteness in part because I wanted to think about this relationship. And so I'm interested in how anti-Blackness and anti-Asian racism sort of entangle and inform one another, but they're irreducible to one another. And so, for example, in the chapter on the affirmative action case, the case is unnerving because it takes this sort of age-old anti-Black backlash to affirmative action and it reframes it in this quote-unquote anti-racist language of defending Asian Americans from discrimination. And those concepts become particularly key, right? These abstract concepts like what is discrimination? How are we understanding discrimination and what does justice look like, right? And the case ultimately frames that those concepts, they come alive through the stories, the narratives that SFFA and the SCOTUS decision tells. And so there's this extended analogy in the majority opinion and also in, SFFA's sort of larger case where they're comparing affirmative action to Plessy versus Ferguson, the sort of infamous ruling that maintains segregation, right? And then they compare the gutting of affirmative action to Brown versus Board. This is interesting and important insofar as Asian Americans as victimized subjects are legible as victims through anti-Blackness as a narrative template through their reference, through this extended, I think inaccurate, but this extended analogy, right, to, oh, well, affirmative action is just the latest, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? And this does a number of different things. It consigns anti-Blackness as something in the past, right? It buys into these narratives of progress. It also analogizes and homogenizes anti-Asian racism with anti-Black racism, and that slippage is what allows them to say that they're anti-racist when they're doing something racist, right? But all of that is important because those two things, the figures, the Asian American applicant and the Black applicant, and these concepts of discrimination and justice become legible right through their interrelationship. And so on the one hand, right, anti-Blackness is forming this narrative template through which to make sense of Asian American victimhood, right? And it's only through reference to this that they become legible as victimized figures. At the same time, this victimhood makes Asian Americans into key figures for reframing anti-Blackness in the language of progress. And so, Asian American racialization then helps to repackage anti-Blackness in less overt but more insidious terms, and it helps to make Western men more resilient in the face of critique and charges of racism. And so while I would see, anti-Blackness as foundational and in terms of understanding these larger systems, Asian Americans are also functioning as important narrative figures to help repackage anti-Blackness, to help it to continue and to help it to adapt in the face of critique. And so all of that is to say that they are, interrelated with one another, but they're irreducible to one another. And I think that producing vocabularies that describe how they interact rather than just sort of saying this is all white supremacy or this is all whiteness is important work, both within rhetorical theory, but also, more broadly.
I so appreciate that you're attending to that.
Yeah, I think because you brought it up, we wanted to actually jump to your case study on students for fair admissions versus Harvard. I'll just say for me, this was a really fascinating chapter, just the nuances of the legal reasoning and how you're analyzing the legal reasoning, not strictly in terms of legal rhetoric, but as part of this broader, allegorical, rhetorical work of racialization. And you talk about, as you were just discussing, how anti-racism is used as a discursive resource to uphold and expand racial violence, in part by deploying certain racial legibilities, so like the victimized and meritorious Asian student, to validate existing hierarchies. I think we wanted to ask, has your perspective on this process changed at all since the Trump administration's and multiple states' open assaults on DEI and academic research and higher ed in general? And I'll just add something that I was particularly fascinated by: the figure of Edward Bloom in this legal history, right? And so if you could talk about him and, just a particular kind of guy, right?
Yeah, Students for Fair Admissions is an anti-affirmative action advocacy organization that's headed by Edward Bloom, who's a white man. He's a legal strategist. He's not a lawyer, and he wasn't like the main lawyer who like argued the case or whatever, but he was, the sort of legal strategist behind the case. And he has had a long career of challenging the use of race in admissions, as well as a number of other things. I think is part of this larger, like the Project on Fair Representation. And so they'll attack race conscious policies, not just in education, but his career, right, sort of begins when he loses, I think it's a local election, and he argues it's because the districts were drawn to like favor minority voters, basically. And so then he goes on to challenge this in, I think it's Bush v. Vera, and, wins the case. But then he moves into sort of the realm of legal strategy and has this long history of challenging affirmative action. And so SFFA was not the first time that he was in a high profile SCOTUS battle. He was the legal strategist for the Fisher cases, and I think it's 2013 and 2016. But
Yeah, if you could remind our listeners about those cases as well.
yeah, so the Fisher cases dealt with the case of Abigail Fisher, who was a white woman applicant to the University of Texas, and she's denied admissions, whatever. So the case argues that she was discriminated against on the basis of her race. It reaches SCOTUS in 2013. They determined that the lower court didn't apply strict scrutiny, so then they had to go back down and then come back up in 2016. So anyways, the Supreme Court ultimately rules against Abigail Fisher, but importantly, although Asian Americans were not the key figures, there is a reference, in the larger decision that the court may be sort of open or sympathetic to claims that Asian Americans are discriminated against. Edward Bloom has this sort of speech. It's on YouTube. I think I cite it, to the Houston Chinese Alliance, where he says he's narrating his journey. When he says after Fisher, the first Fisher case, he quote, needed Asian plaintiffs, end quote. He says this to a largely Asian American audience, just wild, right? But so he's like explicitly going out and trying to recruit Asian and Asian American plaintiffs in order to, sort of attack affirmative action, right? And so I think, this should be the most obvious, like one of the more obvious cues that Edward Bloom does not care about us Asian Americans, but whatever. So it becomes, this almost like reactionary move, right? To then say, well, I need a visible minority, right? Like he doesn't exactly say it like that, but there's a reason why Asian Americans become key narrative figures. And it's because Asian Americans can stand in both as symbols of diversity and somehow paradoxically also as symbols of colorblind meritocracy, right? And so now it's not a reverse, quote unquote, reverse racism case. He's helping Asian Americans, right? And now, Asian Americans are showing us that affirmative action is quote unquote racist against people of color. And so it helps to reframe all of this in sort of a more multicultural, supposedly anti-racist light. And throughout the case, part of what I argue is that they deploy what I call multicultural anti-racism, which are narratives that utilize the language of anti-racism and acknowledge a legacy of racism in order to paradoxically support racial hierarchy. And so it's a little bit distinct from post-racialism and colorblindness, insofar as colorblindness is like the I don't see color, and post-racialism is most exemplified by we recognize racial difference to disavow racial violence. So Obama was president, therefore racism no longer exists, right? Multicultural anti-racism is a little bit distinct insofar as Bloom and other cases of this are not saying that racism doesn't exist anymore. Actually, SFFA locates affirmative action as, the latest instantiation of this history of segregation, but also they are naming COVID era racism, the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese American incarceration, and they're like affirmative action is just the latest, form of structural racism. And so they're very much acknowledging paradoxically, right, the continuing effects of racial violence in order to then utilize it to expand anti-Blackness. Now, I think that what we have going on with the recent anti-DEI stuff is related, but also a little bit distinct. It's probably rhetorically more similar to these appeals to colorblindness and post-racialism than multicultural anti-racism, insofar as they're claiming in a lot of these cases that any discussion of race is akin to racism, right? They assume that white children being uncomfortable in classrooms, for example, is the same as children of color experiencing decades of discrimination, right? And so they're sort of framing it rhetorically as, flattening it. But one thing that has been on my mind is that it's not lost on me that the function of the SFFA case was to gut the diversity rationale for affirmative action, right? And so initially, affirmative action is designed as a remedial policy, right? And it's fraught, and I'm by no means trying to suggest it is, that's like super radical policy, but it is designed at least to combat legacies of discrimination, of segregation, of, the histories of slavery and so on and so forth. In the Bakke case, which is one of the precedents for SFFA in the 1970s, and then in the Gratz and Grutter case in the early 2000s, there are two key shifts. These are all cases that involve arguments that universities are using racial preferences or race-conscious admissions to discriminate against people, right? And so the Bakke case, occurs in the 1970s when a white man, Alan Bakke, argues that he's being discriminated against on the basis of, his race. And so they decide that racial quotas cannot be the means for affirmative action. You can't say we have a medical school that has 8 slots set aside for people of color, right? They say you can't do that. It has to be what's called a holistic admissions process, where race can be taken into account as one of many factors, but it can't be the determining factor that gets you into a school. The other shift that happens here is the remedial rationale is not cited or used by the Supreme Court as being good enough to meet what's called strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is basically the legal sort of standard that you have to meet to take race into account for a policy, right? And so they go with the diversity rationale, that affirmative action is good not because it's combating this history of racism, it's good because it expands campus diversity, right? And it creates a better learning environment because we have diverse ideas and people and it helps us all learn more, right? And so the diversity rationale has this important shift where affirmative action becomes not about remedying a history of violence, but about recognizing difference, right? And that includes race, but also many other forms of difference, right? And so all of this is to say that affirmative action is kind of gutted much earlier, right? And it's defamed much earlier than just the SFFA case. But all of that is to say that that sets the grounds for affirmative action. It rests on the diversity rationale. Diversity is the reason affirmative action is justified until SFFA guts Grutter. And now the diversity rationale has been determined that it was not enough to pass strict scrutiny. The case helps to propel and give momentum to attacks on anti-DEI stuff today because it guts the diversity diversity rationale in my mind. So I do think it frames part of the larger rhetorical environment, although I wouldn't say that the SFFA case is like rhetorically synonymous with the anti-DEI attacks. And then maybe just broader than the case in particular, I'm also interested in how multicultural inclusion operates not as the opposite, in my view, of overt racism, but its interlocutor, right? And so on the most recent presidential election, when on the campaign trail, I remember there was all of this backlash when, like, I think it was during a presidential debate when Trump was like, oh, well, these immigrants are coming and they're taking Black jobs or something like that, right? And there's all of this, important public backlash that is like, this is racist. What is a Black job? What are you saying? But it's also important that he's trying, however inelegantly or like poorly, right, to claim that he's helping Black people and he's saving them from scary quote unquote immigrant populations that are coming to quote unquote take their jobs, right? And so there is this sort of relationship between that I think is still relevant, this sort of appeal to protecting or helping marginalized people and claiming anti-racism, or not even just in regards to the conservatives, but for example, in the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, right? Like a lot of the sort of proponents of the act are, they're trying to help Asian Americans from, experiencing hate crimes. But in doing so, right, they sort of bolster this larger, right, carceral regime that harms marginalized people, including, right, the most marginalized of Asian American populations, the undocumented Asian American populations, the sex worker Asian Americans, the queer and trans Asian Americans, so on and so forth. And so I think that outside of maybe the SFFA case, there's also, similar related narratives that are occurring as well.
Thank you so much for that. I want to say that this is one of the most lucid and compelling histories I've heard of affirmative action and sort of the ways in which this legal history has reshaped the public understanding of anti-racism and even things like DEI. I think so. We could do a whole episode just on that chapter. I wish we could, but I know we want to shift into some other case studies next.
Yeah, I didn't want to take the wind out of the sail because your explanation of that kind of jurisprudential history from these earlier affirmative action cases to the current sort of anti-DEI backlash that we're experiencing is incredibly compelling and quite useful for understanding the way that this process of racialization and, like you said, the interlocutor of anti-racism really does kind of work in tandem. And I think that's also a little bit on display in chapter 2 of your book, which focuses on the film Crazy Rich Asians. I hadn't actually seen this film before I read your book, so I went out and watched it, and then I read your chapter just to kind of get my senses about me, and it really did make good sense of the film for me. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's a 2018 film directed by John Chu, which tells the story of a Chinese-American economics professor who travels to meet her boyfriend's family for the first time in Singapore, a critical location, as you bring up, only to discover these vast class differences between her lifestyle, her upbringing, and her family, and that of her boyfriend, Nix. In the chapter, you perform what you call an intercontextual reading of this film with Daniel Patrick Moynihan's infamous 1965 report, and forgive the terminology here, The Negro Family, A Case for National Action, crafted as a supplement to the Lyndon Johnson administration's War on Poverty campaign, in scare quotes there. So can you tell us, why did you choose to contextually cross-examine a film like Crazy Rich Asians using the Moynihan report, especially in light of the way that we are kind of like flattening out and trying to naturalize hierarchies in society through this lens of racialization, and particularly as it relates to motherhood and family? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, thank you, all of you, for your kind words and thoughtful questions. But yeah, so to be perfectly honest, this chapter was initially a reading of Crazy Rich Asians on its own. It was actually a reviewer that prompted me to go beyond Crazy Rich Asians. They noted the volume of work recently in communication and rhetoric on Crazy Rich Asians specifically, but also, more broadly. They suggested reading it with other films, but then I ended up taking it in a little bit of a different direction, which is to read it alongside the Moynihan report and Moynihan's some broader writings. But, I just want to say shout out to them because I think it made the chapter better. But all of that is to say that each chapter deals with a different set of allegories. As you mentioned, Alex, this one is allegories of family and mothering, right? And so the film utilizes where elsewhere I've called a multicultural redemption narrative, which we could think about as a type of racial allegory or one example of a form of racial allegory. Allegory, which are narratives that constrain the imaginative boundaries of racial liberation to upward mobility in existing hierarchies. So the opening hotel scene, right? Eleanor buys the hotel on the spot after being told to find a place in Chinatown, right? And all of this is sort of meant to show her empowerment. Like she really stuck it to this white concierge guy who was telling her to go to Chinatown, right?
Good evening. I'm Reginald Ormsby, hotel manager. Is there a problem?
I'm Mrs. Eleanor Young. My family and I would like to be shown to our suite. We've had a long flight.
We're fully booked, madam. You must have made a mistake. I'm sure you and your lovely family can find other accommodation. May I suggest you explore Chinatown?
Eleanor, I've just got off the phone with your husband. Now, get the Lancaster suite ready now.
Surely you're joking, sir.
I assure you I am not. As of this evening, my family's long history as custodians of the Calthorpe is ended. I am selling the hotel to my dear friends, the Young family of Singapore. Meet the new lady of the house, Eleanor Young. Join me for a toast.
We'd be delighted. To get a mop. The floor is wet.
The scene ends with this like moment of racial triumph because she got him, right? But what's important here is that her empowerment in that moment is only through wielding excessive capitalist wealth, right? It's only through wielding hierarchies, not through dismantling them. And so again, here, what are the allegories, but what are they doing, right? And in this case, it's telling Asian American audiences or other audiences that the way out of racism is to wield power and to wield hierarchies, not to dismantle them, right? And in this chapter, I really wanted to focus on how those racial narratives are shaped by gender and sexuality, right? So if in the first chapter of the book, it focuses on dating websites and Asian fetish, and I kind of talk about how Asian fetish like sort of renders Asian American women these depersonalized appendages and sexual reservoirs for, white people's desires. Chapter 2, on the other hand, is interested in how the quote unquote feminist agency of these East Asian and East Asian American characters like Rachel or Eleanor are predicated primarily on their ability to wield capitalist or colonial violence. And so you have like the sort of obvious displays of wealth, but then you also have, for example, the sort of larger frame and context, the colonial context of Singapore, the Southeast and South Asian service workers, right? And so it's only through their ability to wield power over these other sort of Asian and Asian American communities that these East Asians can have this sort of like, feminist agency. And so at the same time, I'm interested in how Carrie and Eleanor, Carrie is Rachel's mom, they stand in as these competing depictions of Asian American versus Asian motherhood. And so they're allegories for, or they become allegories for, right, American capitalism and Chinese capitalism. And I'm interested, for example, in how Carrie, who is the mother of Rachel, right, gets the sort of narrative of like tough immigrant grit, right? Whereas Eleanor and the other crazy rich Asians gets the like excessive wealth, like tiger mother stereotype, right? And so I think that there are value judgments being made here about this narrative of the American dream versus this sort of like excessive displays of Asian wealth. And all of that is mediated through the domestic space of the dinner table and the intra-family conflicts and the wedding party. And so I'm interested in how these larger geopolitical contexts, these larger sort of ideas are filtered through and are made legible through reference to these domestic spaces of highly gendered norms, right? Now, you see a lot of similar resonances in the Moynihan report and Moynihan's broader work. And I would argue that the Moynihan report and its afterlives shaped the discursive environment, or as Hortense Spillers would put it, the American grammar, quote unquote, that Crazy Rich Asians gets its legibility from. And so the Moynihan report describes Black people's conditions of suffering as a product of quote unquote matriarchal family structures stuck in a quote unquote tangle of pathology. And Asian Americans are not the focus of the report, but interestingly become significant in a number of different comparative moments when Moynihan is writing. So in a memo to the president that Moynihan writes distilling the report, Moynihan has this line where he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but the color problem is not intractable. It's not inevitable. Chinese and Japanese Americans have experienced all of this discrimination, but since then they've been able to assimilate or achieve upward mobility in ways that Black families have not. And I believe this is because of their close-knit family structures, right? And so Again, here, right, we see the way that these larger questions of structural inequality, et cetera, are being threaded through the domestic space of the family, as well as how Asian Americans are becoming narrative figures, right, for perpetuating anti-Blackness, for rationalizing these larger systems of violence. It's also, this is the time with the mass rise of the model minority. It's the height of the Cold War, so it's rationalizing the US as sort of benign and inclusive in the face of, quote unquote, all of these communist threats, so on and so forth. So it's doing all of this rhetorical work, and it's not totally dissimilar to the situation that we're living through now. And so you see a lot of these sort of similar themes, and the figure of the empowered, Asian mother in Crazy Rich Asians is not just random, right? It's made possible through reference implicitly to whiteness, right? Because Asian families, they're traditional. They're not like these white feminists that, want their freedoms and stuff, right? They want to be traditional homemakers, but also in relationship to Blackness, right? They're not the pathologized, Black mother. They, are these sort of romanticized, strict mothers, so on and so forth. And so all of that is to say that I thought it was a helpful way to understand that even though there are no Black characters in the film, and there's only one white person in the film, which is the concierge, well, I guess there's two people who work at the hotel, but there's two, white people in the whole film, and they're just in the very beginning, right? All of these figures become legible through, right, these sort of competing references to whiteness and to Blackness, and they shape the larger discursive environment that allows us to view the film and understand all of these narratives as legible in the first place. And so I wanted to read them together. Oh, and I guess the other thing I should say is intercontextual reading. I wish it was my term. It's not my term. It's an approach I draw from Dr. Lou Mirage in his book, Anti-Racist Campus Rhetorics. But he talks about intercontextual reading as, reading together these sort of seemingly disparate sources, contexts, and bodies and texts to understand how they interact as dynamic sites of meaning making. And so I, in rhetoric, but also academia more broadly, I've, long been socialized that you don't mix all these sources, you don't, and I get it. You want to tell, people don't do too much, whatever, don't bite off more than you can chew. I get it. But so you analyze film, or you analyze legal rhetoric, or you analyze policy, but you do not put them all together, right? But what I quickly learned, and I think that, what a lot of us sort of come up against when we're talking about, race and gender and so on and so forth, is that that's not how power works. Racialization does not obey neat disciplinary boundaries. It references, popular culture informs the legal case informs, media is informed by social media, that's informed by, whatever. And so it does not obey these boundaries. It's adaptive. It moves across media, law, popular culture, online communities. And so we need rhetorical methods that are equally as capacious and flexible and interdisciplinary to really account for them. And for me, intercontextual readings really, I think, was important for me being able to do that. I don't think I would have thought it possible to read the Moynihan report together with Crazy Rich Asians unless I had read that text first, right? So I just want to shout out Mirage's work. I wish it was my term, but it's not.
No, that's totally fair. Yeah, I didn't mean to attribute it just specifically to you, but I think that you are, to your credit still, I think that you're doing work that proves that intercontextual readings need to happen in this kind of, it is actually quite a real necessity in order to understand the full sort of cultural afterlife of, and again, there's the sort of porous boundaries between what we typically might otherwise consider to be cordoned off genres or, types of text that don't speak to one another. No, I think you did a really amazing job of really showing, like you said, those kind of resonances between the two, the Moynihan report and Crazy Rich Asians, especially in just following up from a thread that you mentioned in response to the last question, the way that anti-racism, or the sort of the way that we might conceptualize sort of on the surface anti-racism can actually be used to masquerade in all of these kind of retrograde ideas that are actually, like you were pointing out here, echoes of a much more on its face racist kind of reinforcing racial hierarchies, shoring up this concept of Western man, but doing it with a patina of something that feels radical. And I think that that's greatly to your credit that an intercontextual reading can really expose that. Sorry, I'll stop singing your praises now because I know Sarah has another question for you too.
No, please continue. It's fine.
Yeah, we'll just cancel the rest of the Q&A. That's what we're going to do now.
This is the gassing up podcast. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah, I mean, I do. I think that the intercontextual reading really it's kind of operationalizing Natalia Molina's racial scripts in a way, right? Like helping us see these different temporalities, like Alex said, these afterlives, how these things communicate with each other, and like you said, like laying this very fertile, like discursive ground for viewing, for literally like reading, being able to read the film in these different ways. And it's also great because I think that the racial allegories, like grounding in these racial allegories of motherhood and family, help to negotiate some of these like contradictory readings of like Eleanor, for instance, who is on one hand like total girl boss and on the other hand like tiger mother, right? So I think it's really brilliant and hopefully like an inspiration to other common rhetoric scholars who are interested in reading things across space and time that speak to one another. Certainly very inspiring for me. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about inanimacies and the inhuman. So we talked before about the title, Making the Human, how that came together, why that was so important for you to link the idea of making the human with Asian American racialization and racial allegory, which of course is this really rich concept that you coin. I was curious as to why it was important for you to bring together inanimacies and the inhuman into these conversations with Asian American racialization and its role in showing up Western man. Because I think that like many people, including myself, if I could write something this brilliant, I would have stopped there, right? I think it's so brilliant to also bring into conversation how figurations of animacy and inanimacy play such an important role. So I wanted to know how that ended up being brought in for you, and especially in the context, not necessarily exclusively, but especially in the context of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the topic of your fourth chapter.
Yeah, thank you. And also, last I heard, you were working on a book project, and I believe that it'll be much more, brilliant than anything I could do. But I really appreciate the question. And yeah, in animacies and the conversation about the sort of boundaries of the human are important. I kind of mentioned Sylvia Wynter earlier. Some other thinkers that were important were Mel Chen's work in their book Animacies. They talk about various animacy hierarchies and have a chapter on lead, for example, and the scare around Chinese companies having lead in like toys or something. And so, they're like, how does this like inanimate, sort of like substance, like how is it imbued with racial qualities and so on and so forth. And then similarly, Zakiya Jackson talks about race and species as mutually constitutive, not like there's the human non-human divide primarily, and then secondary to that we have the racial divide, the gender divide, the whatever divide, whatever. But Jackson is very much saying that they're mutually constitutive, that the way that we understand species and the boundaries of the human are wrapped up with racialization. So they were important for my thinking throughout the whole book, but especially in the chapter on COVID-19, because the COVID-19 pandemic, we see these larger narratives that are trying to reckon with largely unprecedented in our lifetime global pandemic that is bringing the world to its knees. I remember people talking about, oh, it's like the flu, whatever. And then 3 months later, I'm in lockdown at Zoom University teaching my students. So there is very much this shock. And of course, I'm drawing on other scholars and stuff like that. But I think, global pandemics and other global catastrophes have a way of leaving us without words, without the ability to account for them. And, when something disrupts the global order or lived experiences or whatever, it requires a series of different narratives to help make sense. We use narrative to make sense of the world around us, right? And so, I remember being particularly interested in the way that we have COVID-19 as a virus that is imperceptible to the human eye, that is moving seamlessly between various bodies, right? And so this chapter is more interested in the public health narratives about COVID-19 than maybe like the explicit racism, although that is important too. But we have these narratives of these like sort of imperceptible viruses that are moving through and spreading through people, right? And so the virus is interesting because it's animate, it's moving, it's spreading, but it only can live with human hosts, right? The way that a lot of the public discourse across the globe, but especially in the US, sort of reconciles with a lot of these crises is by confining narratively, right, the virus to the bodies of Asian Americans or Asian people as supposed carriers or uniquely carriers of the virus, right? And so I'm interested in how, Asian Americans are narratively framed as the quote unquote asymptomatic carriers or the quote unquote zoonotic reservoirs I know that's a scientific concept, but I'm sort of, playing on it here, for, right, threatening the white national body, right? And what becomes interesting here is that you have these sort of this larger right threat. You have these larger narratives. People are criticizing the Trump administration's handling of the pandemic by saying, oh, well, the US has become like a third world country, right? And that was like really just interesting rhetoric to me because one, it exceptionalizes Trump. And so it assumes that, Trump is, the exception to the rule of an otherwise quote unquote democratic, civilized, advanced, first world nation. But it also discloses a racial anxiety about the sort of diseases and viruses that are traditionally in popular discourse imagined to be out there, over there in these African and Asian like countries that don't touch us over here in the West, right? And they're coming across these borders, they're interacting and infecting people. And so it kind of shatters this perception of the distance between the quote unquote first world and the quote unquote third world, right?
We could also probably say that it ignores that many of those quote unquote third world countries did a better job containing the pandemic than the first world, right?
Absolutely. And with the vaccine apartheid that we see afterwards, like the US had immediate access, you know what I mean? As well as these other Western countries too, as soon as there were treatment and vaccines and whatever. So it very much denies the way that other countries are handling the pandemic better. It also denies the fact that the US is so privileged in its access when these treatments and vaccines come out. But it discloses these larger sort of narrative anxieties. And we then utilize anti-Asian allegories or narratives to confine the virus to clear scapegoats, carriers. And so it becomes, right, that crisis becomes manageable. And so this becomes important because it illustrates the slipperiness between the body, the individual body and the carrier and the racialized subject and the nation, as well as the sort of porous boundaries between ourselves in literally like the virus traveling, but also the ways that that then gets wrapped up with these larger anxieties about racial difference and contagion.
It's so interesting to think about the pandemic, the way you narrate it in related to, the porousness, like the anxieties and fears around like the porousness of the body. And there's a really great Janelle Johnson article I think about all the time that talks about these kinds of visceral fears about the penetration of the body. And I love that you're talking about this as a whole, not just like it's about racially defining, but also that is a part of that you're bringing that into conversation, that it's a part of defining who's deserving of being human, who belongs in that category, and who is encroaching upon our physical bodily boundaries and therefore is not human or threatens what it means to be the human. Kevin has a follow-up question.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I was thinking about, and I just wanted to comment briefly on the example of lead. I think is so fascinating. I just wanted to say, like, it made me think of Flint, Michigan, and the discourse around how Flint was, more or less like structurally denied safety and health by the state, right, in collusion with private interests, and how that racialization enabled that structural violence. But that's a total sidebar that I just thought of. I think we were interested to hear more if you had thoughts on the ways that COVID-19 and these racialized anxieties that informed discourses about it and discourses about Asian communities, Asian American communities, how that relates to the larger geopolitical competition between the US and China. I think this is particularly important and significant in the Trump era. There's so much open national security bigotry towards China and towards the kind of new Cold War discourse and bringing back many of the tropes from earlier eras of Cold Wars. I guess one very recent example of this that we saw is that I wanted to bring up is that there's a new bill introduced in Congress to bar Chinese nationals from student visas. This was introduced by Riley Moore of West Virginia. It's called the Stop Chinese Communist Prying by Vindicating Intellectual Safeguards in Academia Act. They always come up with these horrific names to allow for acronyms. So the acronym is Stop CCP Visas Act. But so we're seeing all of this kind of new Cold War discourse that builds on the racialized anxieties that you talk about in this chapter. So we just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts on the relationship to national security rhetoric.
And I want to quote Riley Moore. This is a quote. "We've literally invited the CCP to spy on our military, steal our intellectual property, and threaten national security." End quote.
Yeah. So that's an excellent question. And just, it's like I should stop. I need to stop being surprised about things, you know? It's like every time there's a new thing, I'm like, oh, and then it's like all my research has told me that this is, been in the making. But yeah, I mean, seeing the sort of escalating just police state in general is really disturbing. And also, again, I think you all are pointing out just really amplifying a lot of these Cold War scripts that were very much in play. The quote that you outlined there also really at play in a lot of these discourses really is the slippage between body and nation, right? That now the sort of bodies of Asian people are stand-ins for the country and the geopolitical security threats or risks or whatever that they're affiliated with. And so there's this sort of narrative slippage that I think happens there that is important for how then the United States frames particular people through these very racialized and politicized narratives that attach them as representatives of their quote unquote home nation state. The other thing that what you all were saying too that sort of gets me thinking is the relationship. There's always this sort of larger narrative in US pop culture and political discourse that frames China and, whatever, other, maybe to an extent, other Asian nations, but as both a hyper technologically advanced threat and also this backward, sneaky, uncivilized nation, right? So you see it in the discourses around COVID-19. I sort of talk about in the chapter the narratives about the quote unquote lab leak theory. And those range from China developed this as a bioweapon to it was an accidental release, as well as the narratives around the wet markets and how wet markets are, these places of zoonotic contact, and that those two things are doing very interesting work because one of them frames, Asian people and Asian nations at the threshold of the superhuman, right? Super technologically advanced, super, threatening, dangerous, right? And, on the other sort of boundary, right, of the subhuman, right, these sort of like backwards, people who like eat bats and sell food in wet markets and stuff like that. And it is not lost on me that there is an extreme amount of zoonotic contact that occurs, right, in the US food system, for example, right? And so it's not like this is unique, but it very much, right, you see the sort of slippage between advanced threat and also backwards and uncivilized, right? And I think that that's at play in some of the contemporary US national security rhetoric as well. Actually, one of the things I was thinking about was the discourses around the TikTok ban, because they would sort of use this like similar fear mongering of like, oh, well, China will steal our data and they'll surveil us and blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying that's not a real thing. Like, I'm not trying to romanticize China either. This is also a country that's deeply embedded in racial violence, capitalist, sort of ascendancy and colonial exploitation. I want to recognize that. But when they're like, oh, well, China will steal our data and they'll surveil us, I'm like, I'm on Instagram, y'all. Like, the US kind of already is doing that to me. You know what I mean? Like,
There's also the NSA
right,
exists,
right. That's what I'm saying. And so it's interesting insofar as these sort of larger racialized threat narratives both frame them through that they're both technologically advanced, but they're also not as trustworthy with how they surveil us. So they're not as civilized in how they think about privacy, all of these things at the same time that we're living in an escalating police state that is actively stripping away our rights and, whatever. So I think that here it's doing narrative work, right? It's doing narrative work. It's utilizing these racialized narratives to smash together and create narrative slippages between body and nation to make sort of coherent understandings of the world where then, people can then go and say, well, yeah, like we do need to really limit the influence of, Chinese people or whatever. At the same time, the US is doing very similar forms of violence. And so,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just want to say I love the way that you were pointing out so many of these hypocrisies and sort of blind spots, like this concept of the wet market. Like what, you mean a farmer's market? Is that what you're talking about? Because I think we have those, right? It's not as if, as you're saying, this zoonotic contact is happening right now with the ways in which bird flu is becoming increasingly threatening to the US food market. These sort of zoonotic interpenetrations are in all food markets, and yet that became so crucial to the Western imaginary towards how COVID-19 started. And I also love that you frame that debate in a way that clarifies it it clarifies it for me in a way had never sort of thought through, which was that whichever side you're on about the origins of COVID-19, you're being racist towards China regardless, like, which is fascinating.
Well, and the question of origins is also really interesting to me because the narrative of patient zero is very interesting because it's always like whatever, like it's a bioweapon, whatever. It's like an intentional malice, or it's like, in the sort of wet market zoonotic contact narrative, it's always like somebody sort of gets this virus from their contact with animal or non-human carrier, and then in a fleeting passing moment, they accidentally kick off this global pandemic, right? And it's like, that is interesting. And I'm not denying that, whatever, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a specialist in zoonotic, like I'm not trying to stake a claim there, but where you start the narrative also matters, right? Because the zoonotic contact did not just come out of nowhere. The zoonotic contact is fueled by global capitalist and colonial violence. You know what I mean? And so if you start at the moment that the virus, it jumps from an animal to a human or whatever, right? That is still a narrative choice. That's a rhetorical choice, right? That then doesn't necessarily take into account all of the colonial and capitalist violence that was necessary to make a situation possible for the virus to break out, then for it to spread, then for all of these things like detention centers and prisons and places where people are crammed into these spaces and the virus will spread. Like, all of these power structures are erased when we're focused on where we start the narrative there. And so I think what
Absolutely.
you're saying, like, yeah, sort of
That's such a
Yeah.
brilliant point. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And I also think it's interesting because in some ways there are some cases where these rhetorics almost can create the conditions for their own contradiction. Like the TikTok case was especially interesting because then people jump to Red Note, right? That's what it's called, right? Red Note. And again, similarly, Corinne, China has many, many, many problems, which we don't have to get into, but there were a lot of people who jumped to Red Note. We're seeing a lot of content created by people living in China, and we're like, oh, I'm actually having realizations that I was fed propaganda about China my entire life and would not have had that realization had there not been such a concerted effort to ban TikTok in the United States, right? So I think it's a little bit hopeful because, I mean, in many cases, people in power will perpetuate these things regardless of whether or not their constituents want that. But there are some cases where you have these leakages and ruptures and fissures where the restrictions are so tight that it actually creates opportunities for people to have alternate realizations about the narratives that they have been fed about how China is backwards, unethical, and generally unsavory.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up too, Sarah, because I mean, it allows me to plug another Reverb episode that we did all the way back in 2020, I believe it was, or 21, which was specifically about the first time that the Trump administration introduced an executive order to ban TikTok, which preceded the one that happened under the Biden administration, strictly speaking, by quite a few years, that was trying to provide this kind of national security brinksmanship. Our analysis there was covering how it was coinciding with other executive orders about the ownership of information and communication technology infrastructure, which is, I think, again, the kind of, as we're saying, it's when you start to decode these narratives using some of the tools that Corinne, you're giving us here. I mean, it starts to become very, I don't want to say immediately transparent, but definitely like the contradictions kind of open themselves up where it's like, okay, these allegories are in place for a very specific reason, and it is to cover for the interests of people who stand to make a profit off of the exploitation of others or just the general exploitation of, capital and other kinds of hierarchies for themselves. I think that there's never an easy way to move towards let's have some pithy conclusions here from such a conceptually elegant book. It feels like a disservice to do that, but I did want to kind of move us towards, making the human is, among many other things, an antidote to notions of anti-Asian racism, both as a form of false representation. And again, this is not to diminish the significance, but individualized acts of hate as encompassed by the Stop Asian Hate movement. But I wanted to ask, what sort of understanding about anti-Asian racism do you hope that readers would take away from reading your book?
Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I think the framing of anti-Asian racism as hate, for example, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Atlanta shooting and in the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was perhaps well-intentioned, but very dangerous. As I discuss, it sort of unintentionally does a few things. It frames anti-Asian racism as episodic or exceptional, rather than systemic, right? So it's an aberration rather than the logical outcome of a country built on violence. It also frames it as committed more by fringe individuals or lone wolves rather than, and it certainly is committed by individuals, right? But also by state sanctioned institutionalized violence, right? And so, as a result, I think that when we frame problems in certain ways, then solutions respond in kind, right? And so when we frame anti-Asian racism as bias or individualized hate, then the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which funds more law enforcement, which, as I sort of mentioned earlier, negatively impacts the most marginalized of Asian American communities and all of these other communities, right? But when we frame it as individualized hate committed by fringe racists, then the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act makes logical sense, right? It's like, oh, yes, we need more police to protect the community, whatever. And so I think that there are significant impacts to the way that we frame violence and all of that. So I guess what I would want people to come away with is an understanding that anti-Asian racism is more pernicious than hate. It is more widespread than hate. As I talk about in chapter 1 with Asian fetish, sometimes it comes through in the language of love, right? In SFFA, sometimes it comes through in the language of protection. And so it doesn't have to be overt malice or fueled by a negative emotion in order for it to be significant. It's also much more flexible and dynamic than hate or even false representation, right? And so I am hoping to think about anti-Asian violence as state sanctioned, as structural rather than episodic, and is interwoven with, but irreducible to systems of settler colonialism, anti-Blackness, and capitalism.
So finally, in a related vein, as I'm sure, that you and we both grapple with this as Asian American scholars, we're very used to thinking about the utility of the term Asian American. And you discuss this in a very nuanced way multiple times throughout the book. You're using Asian American differently depending on how you want the reader to understand the way you're approaching Asian American in a particular chapter, a particular moment. You point out with very good reason that Asian American is a very fraught term that's often insufficient for naming what you describe as common racial experience or positionality. Absolutely true. It's the most ethnically and socioeconomically diverse racial category that we have in the United States. So you do talk multiple times throughout the book about different things that organizations, groups of people, certain populations do to sort of counter these rhetorics, to create alternate epistemes, ways of knowing, ways of seeing the world. So I'm wondering if, in closing, you would like to riff or ruminate at all on Asian American itself as a term. Do you think it can serve as a resource in any way? And are there ways that you think it can be used? I hate to say, especially now in these times, but we are in the times that we're in, towards world building or towards justice in some form, small or large.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I feel like these times are the most important times to ask those questions. The term Asian American is fraught. It emerges as this sort of pan-ethnic term in the Asian American movement, right? Largely for activist purposes, for purposes of combating racism, for producing coalitional possibilities. At the same time, as many scholars have pointed out, it can be really homogenizing. It erases the varied relationships that Asian Americans have to racism and to one another. That includes the intra-Asian American relationships, like reconciling with the realities of Japanese colonialism, right? Or it can also be like the relationship to anti-Asian racism in the US, right, is shaped very differently for Southeast Asian refugees that come over as a result of the US military interventions abroad, are interrelated with, but have a distinct history and relationship to racialization than do the post 1965 East Asian Immigration and Nationality Act, East Asian immigrants, for example. And that's not to say that they don't have places of convergence, that there aren't possibilities for solidarity, but a lot of those differences are very much covered over. And oftentimes, East Asian American citizens are overrepresented, to riff on Winter, overrepresented as what it means to be Asian American itself. So I am hoping to sort of problematize these things. I'm interested in the book and how the category gets deployed in ways that expand it or shrink it in ways that, sort of uphold power relations. In the SFFA case, actually early on in the case, SFFA in the 2014, the initial complaint, they mentioned like all of these different Asians. They mentioned East Asians and South Asians and Southeast Asians, right? And then soon, by the time it's at SCOTUS, they're just talking about Chinese and Japanese people in their examples, right? And then, right, so then they narrow the category. So East Asians stand in for what it means to be Asian American. And then curiously, Chief Justice Roberts, in his majority opinion, has this moment where he's like, the categories that Harvard uses for admissions is actually really illogical because, like, what about the South Asians, right? Which was like really like, so then, right, he expands it, right, for the purpose of then, enacting violence. I'm more and more interested in the book in seeing the ways that the category is deployed than in trying to rescue the category or try to create a more comprehensive category. That being said, my point is not to abandon racial categories because that's just colorblindness, right? And so, I'm not calling for people to stop saying the word Asian American or that people shouldn't use the term to organize or create analytical paradigms or whatever. But I do think it's important to let go of the desire for Asian American as a comprehensive category. Sometimes there's a push to try and make a more accurate, a more whole, a more representative understanding of representative category of Asian American. This is why I stray away from false representation, because the solution, right, in my mind is not to say, well, this is an incorrect representation of Asians. Let's replace it with a quote unquote positive representation, because I'm more interested in what is the representation doing to uphold power hierarchies or to dismantle them, but also because language is kind of by necessity, right? It's a shortcut. It will never be comprehensive. The term Asian American or whatever term, right, is not going to be comprehensive. It's used to help us to distill these unimaginably complex things and ideas into words, into phrases, right? And so I guess I'm less interested in rescuing the term Asian American or making it, more quote unquote accurate or, larger, or just including more and more and more into it. And I'm more kind of in the reverse, right? What can we do instead of trying to make the category bigger? What can we do? How can we use our stories about Asian Americanness to unravel or undo the taken for granted notion of that category? What if we tried to find the ways that these critiques undo these categories in unexpected ways, the way that they agitate embedded ways of knowing, in ways that they help us to let go of ways of being or understanding that are keeping us from seeing the intertwined nature of our struggles? And so I'm interested in thinking about Asian American not as a representative or a comprehensive category, but more as a process of undoing. And I'm interested in what possibilities that affords. As it relates to more practical considerations and coalition and stuff, I do think it's important to think about, what if instead of needing to have a common experience, we build coalitions on the fact that our struggles don't need to be the same to be worth fighting for? You know what I mean? Like having discussions about the ways that anti-Asian racism against various different Asian groups, as well as racial violence or other forms of violence against other groups, need not be the same or a common experience in order to be something that is important that we fight against. And I guess the just last thing I'll say, it's not in the book, but the next sort of thing I'm working on, I'm interested in reframing the model minority, not as a false representation or as a non-discursive political positionality, and instead as a carceral logic. I'm analyzing some archival materials on Asian American movement activists and thinking about how anti-carceral sort of activism and coalition building becomes like a fruitful ground for connecting various different sort of struggles. But that's still in the works, so don't ask me too many questions about it.
So excited for that. Yes. I mean, and the final chapter of the book on carceral logics is also brilliant. I absolutely love the way you're thinking about the term, not as a binary question of like, is it accurate or is it not, which relies on this assumption about the transparency of race and identity. Your answer in some ways answers the question, which is like, it serves as a resource insofar as it is almost like an analytic for helping us see, like, if we look at the construction of Asian American and what purposes it serves, it helps us to undo some of those structures. I think is a brilliant kind of like third way of thinking about the term, and helps us sidestep these, in some ways, endless debates about the term, right? Which are very, very tiring and kind of don't really get us anywhere. And I think that, in addition to absolutely like the coalitional possibility of, which was, as you point out, absolutely the historic origins of the term. That was how it was created, kind of in that spirit, but also as an invitation to, in some ways, break it down, and not to say that there are experiences that don't overlap and possibilities for the term itself, even as an identity signifier, but that its use is a signal to further critically examine what that actual use is doing in that particular situation, I think is truly like mind-bendingly brilliant and productive, and exactly what Asian American rhetoric and Asian American studies needs. So thank you for offering that to us.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for this, amazing conversation. And I feel like this has been really generative for me. So I really appreciate you all.
Oh, well, we're happy to hear that. And I think it's probably going to be very generative for our listeners as well. It's a fantastic book, not even just in terms of what Sarah is saying about its kind of intervention into the field of both Asian American studies and rhetoric and communication more broadly, but again, just a really helpful book for making sense of everything from cultural popular art like Crazy Rich Asians all the way to jurisprudence and court cases to, just being able to read all those things cross-contextually and see the role of racial allegory running through all of them is just a really generative, a teaching moment that you could use this book for a lot of other scholars. So we want to say from all of us here at Reverb, thank you, Dr. Corinne Mitsuye Sugino, for coming and sharing your work with us. Your book, Making the Human, Race, Allegory, and Asian Americans, is available now from Rutgers University Press. And I said it about your partner Charles' book, Black Iconoclasm, and I'll say it about yours. Run, don't walk to get this book. This is a fantastic work of scholarship, a joy to read, and really, really happy that we got a chance to talk with you about it. So thank you very much, Corinne, for sharing your time and your work with us. And from all of us here at Reverb, we hope you've enjoyed this conversation today. We will be back at you again with more rhetoric content soon. But until then, we'll talk to you later, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Our show today was produced by Alex Helberg and Calvin Pollock, with editing work by Alex. Reverb's co-producers at large are Ben Williams, Sophie Wadzak, and Olivia Burnett. You can subscribe to Reverb and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Android, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our website at www.reverbcast.com. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ReverbCast. That's REVERB_CAST. If you've enjoyed our show and want to help amplify more of our public scholarship work, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And tell a friend about us. We sincerely appreciate the support of our listeners. Thanks so much for tuning in.